Hey there, friend. Tonight we're diving into something that might make you grateful for every pop quiz, cafeteria mystery meet, and fire drill you've ever endured. We're stepping back into the world of medieval education, where getting your homework wrong could literally be a matter of life and death, and where the closest thing to a school counselor was a monk with a wooden paddle and zero patience for your problems. Before we begin this journey through the dusty corridors of medieval learning, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all gathered here, separated by centuries from these long-ago students who face challenges that would make our worst school days look like a luxury spa retreat. If this kind of historical deep dive helps you unwind, feel free to subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you that peaceful feeling we're all searching for at the end of a long day. Now, settle in, dim those lights, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of what education really looked like when the world was lit by candlelight and ruled by the rhythm of church bells. Picture this. You wake up not to the gentle hum of a smartphone alarm, or even the annoying buzz of a traditional alarm clock, but to the thunderous clanging of a monastery bell echoing across stone walls. It's still dark outside, probably around 4 in the morning, and your feet hit a floor so cold it might as well be carved from ice. Welcome to your first day of medieval school, assuming you're lucky enough to attend one at all. You see, in medieval times, education wasn't a right or even an expectation. It was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, the noble, or those destined for the church. The vast majority of medieval children, somewhere around 90%, would never see the inside of a classroom. They'd learn everything they needed to know about life from watching their parents work the fields, tend the animals, or practice whatever trade kept the family from starving. Reading and writing were luxuries most families simply couldn't afford, not when there were crops to harvest and mouths to feed, but let's say you were one of the fortunate few. Maybe your father was a wealthy merchant, or perhaps your family had decided to dedicate you to religious life, which was often the only path to education for children from modest backgrounds. Either way, you'd find yourself walking through the gates of what passed for a school in medieval Europe, and trust me, it would be nothing like what you're imagining. The medieval classroom was a far cry from the bright, colourful learning environments we know today. Picture instead a single, dim room with thick stone walls that seemed to absorb what little light managed to filter through small, narrow windows. There were no desks as we know them, just long wooden benches without backs, designed more for discipline than comfort. The floors were typically dirt or rough stone, and in winter your breath would fog in the frigid air as you struggled to hold your writing materials with numb fingers. At the front of this cheerless space stood the magister, the teacher, and let me tell you, this was not someone you wanted to cross. Medieval teachers were typically monks or clerics, men who had devoted their lives to learning and had very specific ideas about how knowledge should be transmitted. They carried with them not just books and parchment, but also birch rods, leather straps, and an unshakable belief that learning happened best when accompanied by fear. The school day began before dawn with prayers. Not a quick moment of silence, but lengthy Latin recitations that you were expected to memorize perfectly, stumble over a word, mispronounce a phrase, or heaven forbid, yawn during the proceedings, and you'd quickly become acquainted with your teacher's disciplinary methods. Medieval educators firmly believed that the body had to suffer for the mind to truly absorb knowledge, and they had countless creative ways to ensure that suffering was memorable. Your first lesson would likely be reading, but not from colourful picture books or engaging stories. Instead, you'd be handed a piece of parchment, or, if your school was particularly well funded, a small wooden tablet covered in wax. The text would be religious in nature, probably passages from the Bible or the lives of saints, written in Latin whether you understood that language or not. You'd spend hours tracing letters with a stylus, repeating the same words over and over until your hand cramped and your eyes watered from strain. Writing was an even more torturous affair. Parchment was expensive, made from animal skins that had to be carefully prepared. So students practiced on wax tablets that could be smoothed over and reused. But before you were even allowed to touch a writing instrument, you'd spend weeks, maybe months, learning to hold your stylus correctly. Medieval teachers believed that proper penmanship was a reflection of moral character, so every curve of every letter had to be perfect. Make a mistake, and you'd not only have to start over, but you might also receive a sharp rap across the knuckles for your carelessness. The curriculum was rigid and unforgiving. Everything centered around the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 groups: the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, while the quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But don't imagine these subjects as we know them today. Medieval grammar wasn't about understanding how language works. It was about memorizing endless Latin rules and reciting them perfectly. Logic wasn't about critical thinking. It was about learning to argue in very specific, prescribed ways about religious doctrine. And music wasn't about creativity or self-expression. It was about learning to chant religious songs in the exact manner that had been passed down for centuries. Mathematics was particularly brutal. Without our modern number system, which wouldn't arrive in Europe for several more centuries, students had to perform calculations using Roman numerals. Try multiplying exsolvate by L-thuaid in your head, and you'll get a sense of what these children faced daily. Many calculations required the use of an abacus, but even that was a complex skill that took years to master. A single error in your arithmetic could result in hours of additional practice, often accompanied by physical punishment to help you remember your mistake. The school year didn't follow our familiar September to June schedule. Instead, it was tied to the agricultural calendar and religious observances. Students might attend classes during the winter months when farm work was light, but come spring planting or harvest time, education took a back seat to survival. Religious holidays, and there were many of them, meant frequent interruptions to learning. Some scholars estimate that medieval students received less than half the instructional time that modern students enjoy. Discipline was swift, severe, and public. Medieval educators subscribed to the biblical principle of spare the rod and spoil the child, with an enthusiasm that would horrify modern parents. Being late to class, failing to complete an assignment, speaking out of turn, or showing any sign of disrespect could result in beatings that left lasting marks. Students were expected to hold out their hands to receive strikes from birch rods, or in more severe cases, they might be made to remove their clothes and endure whippings in front of their classmates. But physical punishment was just one aspect of the disciplinary system. Medieval schools also employed psychological methods that were equally harsh. Students who struggled with their lessons might be forced to wear signs around their necks declaring their stupidity. Those who spoke their native language instead of Latin could be given a token of shame that they had to carry until they caught another student making the same mistake. Public humiliation was considered a valuable teaching tool, designed to motivate students through embarrassment and social pressure. The books themselves were few and precious. Most schools owned only a handful of texts, typically religious in nature, and students were expected to memorize entire passages word for word. There were no textbooks as we understand them, no workbooks, no supplementary materials. Learning happened through repetition, recitation, and the constant fear of making mistakes. If you were fortunate enough to have access to a book, you'd likely share it with several other students, taking turns reading aloud while the others listened and tried to commit every word to memory. Meals at medieval schools were simple and often insufficient. Breakfast might consist of bread and weak ale, while dinner could be a bowl of pottage, a thick stew made from whatever grains and vegetables were available. Meat was rare, and fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Many students suffered from malnutrition, which affected their ability to concentrate and learn. The combination of poor diet, harsh discipline, and demanding academic expectations created an environment where only the strongest and most determined could thrive. The social hierarchy within medieval schools was rigid and unforgiving. Students from noble families were treated with more respect and given better accommodations, while those from merchant or artisan backgrounds had to work harder for less recognition. Children dedicated to religious life occupied a middle ground, respected for their spiritual calling, but still subject to the harsh discipline that characterized medieval education. Illness was a constant threat in these close quarters. Without understanding of hygiene or disease transmission, medieval schools were breeding grounds for everything from the common cold to more serious ailments like dysentery or tuberculosis. A single sick student could quickly spread illness throughout the entire school community. Medical treatment was primitive at best, often involving prayers, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, and bloodletting, which frequently made patients worse rather than better. The dormitories, for those students who lived at school, were spartanly furnished and overcrowded. Multiple students would share a single bed, sleeping on straw mattresses that harbored fleas, lice, and other unwelcome creatures. Privacy was non-existent, and personal belongings were few. Students were expected to maintain their own clothing and bedding, skills that many had never learned at home. Despite these harsh conditions, medieval schools did produce some remarkable scholars. The pressure cooker environment, while brutal, sometimes forged minds of extraordinary discipline and capability. Students who survived this system emerged with phenomenal memories, the ability to think and argue according to rigid logical principles, and a deep knowledge of religious and classical texts. They could recite lengthy passages from memory, engage in complex theological debates, and write in elegant Latin prose. But the cost was enormous. Many students broke under the pressure, developing what we might now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, or other mental health issues. Others simply fled, abandoning their education to return to the familiar, if limiting, world of manual labor. The lucky few who completed their studies often carried physical and emotional scars that lasted a lifetime. The medieval approach to education reflected the broader values of the time: hierarchy, discipline, religious devotion, and the belief that suffering was necessary for moral and intellectual development. Students weren't encouraged to question, explore, or think creatively. Instead, they were expected to absorb and regurgitate established knowledge, to conform to rigid standards, and to accept their place in an unchanging social order. As we settle deeper into this exploration of medieval education, remember that these weren't just historical curiosities or amusing anecdotes about the old days. These were real children, some as young as 7 years old, facing challenges that would test the limits of adult endurance. They lived in a world where education was simultaneously precious and punishing, where the promise of knowledge came wrapped in layers of pain and fear. The daily routine of a medieval student would begin hours before most of us even consider waking up. That monastery bell we mentioned wasn't a gentle suggestion that morning had arrived. It was a command that brooked no argument. Students would stumble from their straw mattresses in the darkness, their breath visible in the frigid air, and immediately drop to their knees for the first of many prayer sessions that would punctuate their day. There was no time for personal hygiene as we understand it. A splash of cold water on the face, if you were lucky, and then straight to the chapel for Lauds, the morning prayer service. Remember, these children were often as young as 7, torn from their families and thrust into an environment that valued obedience above all else. They'd kneel on cold stone floors, their small voices joining in Latin chants they might not fully understand, all while fighting off the drowsiness that came from too little sleep and too much fear. After what felt like hours of prayer, the students would shuffle to their single daily meal that could generously be called breakfast. Picture a long wooden table, scarred from years of use, where bowls of thin gruel or porridge awaited. This wasn't the hearty breakfast of champions we're familiar with today. It was a watery mixture of oats or barley, sometimes flavored with a bit of salt if the monastery was feeling generous. The lucky students might find a small piece of bread to accompany their meal, but meat was reserved for feast days and special occasions. The children ate in silence. Medieval educators believed that mealtime conversation was a distraction from proper reflection and gratitude. Any student caught whispering or, heaven forbid, complaining about the food would find themselves going without their next meal entirely. The portions were small, calculated to provide just enough sustenance to keep students functional without making them comfortable. Hunger, after all, was considered a valuable teacher in its own right. Following this meagre breakfast, the real education would begin. But first, students had to prepare their writing materials, and this was no simple task of grabbing a pencil from a backpack. Those wax tablets I mentioned had to be warmed slightly to make them pliable, usually by holding them close to a small brazier, or even against their own bodies. The stylus, typically made of bone or metal, had to be checked for damage and sharpened if necessary. Parchment, when it was available, had to be inspected for holes or imperfections that might cause the expensive material to tear during use. The classroom itself was a study in deliberate discomfort. Those wooden benches weren't just uncomfortable by accident. They were designed to keep students alert and focused. Medieval educators believed that physical comfort led to mental laziness, so every aspect of the learning environment was crafted to maintain a state of controlled discomfort. The lighting was deliberately dim, forcing students to strain their eyes as they copied texts. The temperature was kept cool, ensuring that no one would become drowsy from warmth. When the magister finally entered the room, silence fell like a heavy curtain. These teachers commanded absolute authority, and their word was quite literally law within the classroom walls. Most were monks who had spent years copying manuscripts by hand, men whose entire lives revolved around the preservation and transmission of knowledge. They approached education with a combination of genuine dedication and ruthless pragmatism that could be both inspiring and terrifying. The lesson would begin with the magister reading aloud from a text, usually in Latin, while students followed along on their shared copies. But this wasn't like modern read-alongs, where students might be encouraged to ask questions or share observations. Medieval reading was about perfect reproduction, not comprehension or analysis. Students were expected to memorize not just the words, but the exact intonation, rhythm, and pauses that the teacher used. Grammar lessons were exercises in mental endurance that would make modern standardized tests look like casual puzzles. Students would spend hours declining Latin nouns, conjugating verbs, and parsing sentences with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Every ending, every case, every tense had to be perfect. A single mistake in declension could result in starting the entire exercise over from the beginning, often while standing or kneeling as additional punishment for the error. The teaching methods relied heavily on repetition and fear. A typical lesson might involve the teacher reading a passage 3 times, then calling on individual students to recite it back perfectly. Stumble over a word, forget a phrase, or mispronounce a Latin term, and the consequences were swift and memorable. The birch rod wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a frequently used tool of instruction, but perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval education was the complete absence of encouragement or positive reinforcement. Students were never praised for good work, never told they were improving, never given any indication that their efforts were appreciated. The best a student could hope for was the absence of punishment. Excellence was expected, not celebrated, and failure was met with immediate correction that often involved physical pain. The concept of individual learning styles or accommodating different types of intelligence simply didn't exist. Every student was expected to learn in exactly the same way, at exactly the same pace, using exactly the same methods. Those who struggled with memorization had difficulty sitting still for hours or learned better through hands-on experience were simply considered lazy or stupid. There were no remedial classes, no tutoring, no alternative approaches to help struggling students succeed. Arithmetic lessons were particularly brutal because they required not just memorization, but actual problem-solving skills. Without Arabic numerals, students had to perform complex calculations using Roman numerals, which is roughly equivalent to trying to do calculus while speaking backwards. Adding MCDX Slavo to DCCLX Amwavs required a level of mental gymnastics that would challenge modern mathematicians, yet medieval students were expected to perform such calculations quickly and accurately. The abacus provided some relief from the complexity of Roman numeral arithmetic, but mastering this ancient calculator was itself a formidable challenge. Students had to learn to manipulate the beads with lightning speed while keeping track of multiple calculations in their heads. A single error would cascade through the entire problem, and teachers had little patience for computational mistakes. Geometry was taught through memorization of Euclidean theorems rather than practical application or visual understanding. Students would recite proofs word for word without necessarily understanding the spatial relationships they described. The focus was on preserving classical knowledge rather than developing mathematical intuition or problem-solving skills. Music education centered entirely around Gregorian chant, the complex system of medieval church music that required years to master. Students learned to read neumes, the early form of musical notation that looked more like abstract symbols than the notes we recognize today. They spent countless hours practicing the intricate melodies and harmonies that were considered essential to proper worship. But this wasn't music education as we might imagine it. There was no room for creativity, improvisation, or personal expression. Every note had to be sung exactly as it had been sung for centuries, with precise intonation and rhythm. Students who showed any inclination toward musical innovation were quickly discouraged, sometimes violently. The goal was perfect reproduction of established forms, not artistic development. Astronomy, the final subject in the quadrivium, was taught as a combination of mathematical calculation and theological interpretation. Students learned to track the movements of celestial bodies not out of scientific curiosity, but because this knowledge was necessary for determining religious feast days and understanding God's cosmic plan. The night sky was seen as a divine text to be read and interpreted, not a frontier to be explored. The medieval classroom was also a place of constant surveillance and mutual policing. Students were encouraged, even required, to report on each other's infractions. Speaking one's native language instead of Latin, showing signs of boredom or inattention, or failing to maintain proper posture could all be reported by classmates seeking to curry favor with the teacher or simply to deflect attention from their own shortcomings. This system of peer monitoring created an atmosphere of suspicion and competition rather than collaboration and mutual support. Friendships were difficult to form and dangerous to maintain, as any sign of loyalty to a fellow student could be seen as disloyalty to the teacher or the institution. The medieval classroom was designed to produce scholars, not to nurture childhood relationships or emotional development. As winter days grew shorter and the already dim classrooms became even darker, students would strain their eyes copying texts by the flickering light of tallow candles or oil lamps. The smoke from these primitive lighting sources would fill the air with an acrid haze that made breathing difficult and further compromised vision. Many students developed eye problems from years of reading and writing in poor light, but this was simply accepted as part of the price of education. The copying of texts was itself a form of education, but also a method of preserving knowledge in an age before printing. Students would spend weeks or months creating their own copies of important works, learning every word intimately through the physical act of transcription. But this wasn't the meditative, peaceful activity you might imagine. Every letter had to be perfect. every word spelled correctly, every line straight and evenly spaced. A single error could require recopying an entire page, and the cost of materials meant that mistakes were not taken lightly. The psychological toll of this constant perfection was immense. Imagine spending your entire childhood in a state of hypervigilance, where every movement, every breath, every thought was subject to scrutiny and potential punishment. Medieval students developed what we might now recognize as chronic anxiety, but in their time, this was simply considered proper reverence for learning. They lived in a world where relaxation was seen as moral weakness, where comfort was viewed with suspicion, and where childhood itself was regarded as a temporary inconvenience to be overcome as quickly as possible. The social dynamics within these schools were as rigid as the academic expectations. Students were ranked not just by their academic performance, but by their family's social status, their intended career path, and even their physical appearance. Those destined for the priesthood held a special position, seen as morally superior to their peers, who might eventually return to secular life. The sons of nobles, even if they were poor students, received deference from their classmates, while the children of merchants or artisans had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Bullying, as we understand it today, was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged as a form of social conditioning. Older students were expected to discipline younger ones, often with a cruelty that would make modern educators recoil in horror. A boy who showed signs of weakness, homesickness, or emotional distress would quickly become a target for systematic torment designed to toughen him up for the harsh realities of adult life. Teachers rarely intervened in these situations, viewing them as natural hierarchies that prepared students for their future roles in society. The concept of childhood trauma was completely foreign to medieval thinking. A 7-year-old who wept for his mother was not seen as a child in need of comfort, but as a future adult who needed to learn self-control. Students who couldn't adapt to the harsh conditions were often sent home in disgrace, their families bearing the shame of having raised a child too weak for education. Those who remained learned to suppress their emotions so completely that many never fully recovered the ability to express feelings naturally. Religious instruction permeated every aspect of the school day, but this wasn't the gentle, comforting spirituality that some might imagine. Medieval Christianity, at least as taught in schools, was a demanding, fear-based system that emphasized human sinfulness and divine wrath. Students learned that they were inherently corrupt, that their natural impulses were evil, and that only through constant vigilance and self-denial could they hope to achieve salvation. Prayer sessions punctuated the day at regular intervals, but these weren't moments of peaceful reflection. They were endurance tests where students knelt on hard stone floors for hours, reciting Latin prayers they might not understand while fighting off cramps, hunger, and exhaustion. Falling asleep during prayer was considered a serious offense that could result in public humiliation and physical punishment. Some students learned to sleep with their eyes open, a skill born of desperation and necessity. The theology lessons themselves were exercises in intellectual submission rather than spiritual growth. Students memorized complex doctrinal arguments without being encouraged to question or explore their meaning. Doubt was not seen as a natural part of faith development, but as evidence of moral corruption. A student who asked too many questions about religious doctrine might find himself suspected of heretical tendencies, a dangerous label in an age when religious orthodoxy was literally a matter of life and death. Even the stories used to teach moral lessons were carefully chosen for their ability to instill fear rather than inspire hope. Tales of saints were emphasized not for their examples of love and compassion, but for their willingness to endure horrific suffering for their beliefs. Students learned about martyrs who were burned alive, torn apart by wild animals, or subjected to elaborate tortures, all presented as examples to emulate rather than historical tragedies to mourn. The few recreational activities permitted in medieval schools were structured and competitive rather than playful or creative. Students might be allowed to participate in formal debates, but these followed rigid rules and were judged on adherence to proper form rather than originality of thought. Physical exercise consisted mainly of walking in formation or performing simple calisthenics designed to maintain health rather than provide enjoyment. Games, when they were permitted at all, had educational purposes. Students might play with knucklebones to learn probability or use counting games to practice arithmetic, but the emphasis was always on learning rather than fun. Laughter was viewed with suspicion, as it suggested a lack of proper seriousness about one's studies. A classroom where students seemed to be enjoying themselves was seen as a classroom where learning was not taking place. The dormitory life for boarding students was a study in organized misery. Multiple boys would share a single straw mattress, often without enough blankets to keep warm during the long winter nights. Personal hygiene was minimal, with students bathing perhaps once a month if they were lucky. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions, and skin diseases spread quickly through the close quarters. Privacy was not just absent, but actively discouraged. Students were expected to dress and undress in front of their peers, use communal latrine facilities, and share personal possessions. The goal was to eliminate any sense of individual identity or personal boundaries, creating instead a collective mindset focused entirely on academic and spiritual development. Sleep was another area where comfort was deliberately minimized. Students were awakened multiple times during the night for prayer sessions, and the total amount of rest they received was barely sufficient to maintain basic function. Chronic sleep deprivation was seen as character building, a way to teach young people that comfort and ease were enemies of moral development. The food situation was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval school life. Meals were not just inadequate in quantity and nutrition, they were deliberately unappetizing. The belief was that enjoying food too much was a form of gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins, so students were fed just enough bland, unpalatable fare to keep them alive and functional. Feast days provided some relief from this monotonous diet, but even then, the portions were controlled and the atmosphere remained formal and restrictive. Students were expected to express gratitude for every morsel, no matter how meager or unpleasant, and any sign of dissatisfaction could result in reduced rations for the entire group. The seasonal variations in food availability meant that students faced periods of genuine hunger, particularly in late winter and early spring, when stored provisions ran low. Many developed the hollow-cheeked, undernourished appearance that was actually considered a mark of scholarly dedication. Parents who saw their children during brief visits home were often shocked by their physical deterioration, but this was presented as evidence of serious academic progress. Medical care in medieval schools was primitive and often counterproductive. Illness was frequently attributed to moral failings rather than physical causes, so sick students might find themselves subjected to additional prayers and penances rather than actual treatment. Bloodletting was a common remedy for everything from headaches to stomach ailments, often leaving already weakened students even more debilitated. The understanding of contagious diseases was virtually non-existent, so sick students continued to attend classes and share living spaces with their healthy peers. Epidemics would sweep through schools regularly, claiming the lives of students whose families had sacrificed everything to provide them with an education. These deaths were typically attributed to divine will rather than preventable conditions, and schools rarely changed their practices in response to health crises. Mental health issues, while not understood in modern terms, were clearly present among medieval students. The combination of harsh discipline, social isolation, academic pressure, and physical deprivation created conditions that would challenge even the most resilient adults. Students who broke down emotionally were typically seen as weak or possessed by demons rather than victims of an abusive system. Some students developed what we might now recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, repeatedly checking their work for errors or performing ritual actions to ward off punishment. Others became withdrawn and uncommunicative, going through the motions of academic life while emotionally shutting down completely. A few became aggressive or violent, lashing out at peers or even teachers in desperate attempts to assert some control over their circumstances. The long-term effects of this educational system on those who survived it were profound and lasting. Many medieval scholars emerged from their schooling with remarkable intellectual abilities but severely stunted emotional development. They could engage in complex theological debates and produce elegant Latin prose, but they often struggled with basic human relationships and emotional expression throughout their adult lives. The authoritarian structure of medieval education created adults who were either completely submissive to authority or rebelliously hostile to any form of control. There was little middle ground between these extremes, as the educational system provided no models for healthy independence or collaborative decision-making. Students learned to either dominate or submit, with few skills for genuine partnership or mutual respect. As we delve deeper into this harsh world of medieval learning, it becomes clear that what we're examining isn't just an educational system, but a comprehensive method of breaking down individual identity and rebuilding it according to rigid social and religious specifications. These weren't schools in any sense we would recognize today. They were institutions designed to create a very specific type of adult, one who would fit seamlessly into the hierarchical structure of medieval society without question or complaint. The children who entered these institutions were, in many ways, casualties of their own families' ambitions and society's needs. They paid an enormous personal price for the privilege of literacy and learning, often emerging as fundamentally different people than they would have become under different circumstances. Yet somehow, against all odds, some managed to retain their humanity, their curiosity, and their capacity for growth, becoming the scholars and thinkers who would eventually help transform the very system that had shaped them so harshly. The irony of medieval education becomes even clearer when you consider that many of the greatest intellectual breakthroughs of the period came not from the formal school system, but despite it. The rigid authoritarian approach to learning that characterized these institutions was fundamentally at odds with the kind of creative thinking that drives genuine discovery and innovation. Consider the daily schedule that governed every moment of a medieval student's existence. The day began at 4 a.m. with that bone-chilling monastery bell. But what followed wasn't just early rising. It was a carefully orchestrated assault on any sense of personal autonomy. From the moment students opened their eyes until they collapsed back onto their straw mattresses at night. Every minute was accounted for, every activity prescribed, every thought supposedly monitored. After the dawn prayer service and that meagre breakfast of watery gruel, students would file into their classrooms like prisoners marching to their cells. The magister would already be waiting, birch rod in hand, his face set in the kind of perpetual scowl that suggested he found the very existence of children to be a personal affront. These teachers weren't educators in any sense we'd recognize. They were more like drill sergeants whose mission was to break down young minds and rebuild them according to strict specifications. The actual process of learning was mind-numbingly repetitive. A typical grammar lesson might involve spending 3 hours on a single Latin verb, conjugating it through every possible tense, mood, and voice, while the teacher paced between the benches, ready to strike anyone whose attention wandered even momentarily. Students would chant amo, amas, amat until the words lost all meaning, becoming mere sounds to be produced on command rather than language to be understood. But here's where medieval education revealed its true cruelty: the complete absence of any connection between what students were learning and how they might actually use that knowledge. These children were memorizing vast amounts of information without any context for why it mattered or how it related to the world beyond the classroom walls. They could recite entire books of the Bible in perfect Latin, while having no understanding of what the words actually meant or how they might apply to their own lives. The writing exercises were perhaps even more torturous than the oral recitations. Students would spend hours copying the same passage over and over, not to understand its content, but to achieve perfect penmanship and spelling. Every letter had to be formed identically to the model provided by the teacher. Every word spaced exactly the same distance from its neighbours. A single smudge or slightly crooked line could require starting the entire page over again, and since parchment was precious, mistakes weren't just academically costly, they were financially ruinous. The quill pens themselves were instruments of frustration, made from goose feathers that had to be carefully cut and maintained. They would splatter ink, skip across the parchment, or simply break at the worst possible moments. Students spent almost as much time preparing and repairing their writing instruments as they did actually writing. And a broken quill during an important copying exercise could mean the difference between completing an assignment on time and facing severe punishment. Ink was another constant challenge. Made from a mixture of soot, tree bark, and other materials that had to be carefully prepared and mixed, it would often be too thick or too thin, too light, or so dark it bled through the parchment. Students learned to adjust their writing pressure and speed to accommodate the inconsistencies in their materials, developing a kind of mechanical precision that left little room for personal expression or natural writing rhythms. The mathematical instruction was particularly brutal because it required not just memorization, but actual problem-solving under pressure. Without our familiar Arabic numerals, students had to master the art of calculating with Roman numerals, which is roughly equivalent to trying to perform surgery while wearing boxing gloves. Simple addition problems became complex puzzles that could take minutes to solve, and multiplication or division might require an entire afternoon. The abacus provided some relief from the complexity of Roman numeral arithmetic, but learning to use this ancient calculator was itself a formidable challenge. Students had to develop lightning-fast finger movements while keeping track of multiple calculations simultaneously. The clicking of beads against the wooden frame became a constant soundtrack in medieval classrooms, punctuated by the occasional cry of frustration when a student lost track of their place and had to start over. Geometry lessons were exercises in pure abstraction that would challenge modern graduate students. Without visual aids, beyond the most basic diagrams scratched into wax tablets, students had to visualize complex, three-dimensional relationships entirely in their minds. They would memorize Euclidean proofs word for word, without necessarily understanding the spatial concepts they described, parroting mathematical truths they couldn't actually comprehend. The astronomical component of medieval education was perhaps the most mystifying to young minds. Students learned to track the movements of celestial bodies not out of scientific curiosity, but because this knowledge was essential for calculating religious holidays and understanding divine will. They memorized complex charts showing the positions of planets and stars while being told that questioning the theological implications of these movements was tantamount to heresy. Music education, if it can be called that, consisted entirely of learning Gregorian chant. Students would spend months mastering the intricate neumes that represented musical notation, symbols that looked more like abstract art than anything resembling modern musical notes. Every melody had to be sung exactly as it had been sung for centuries, with precise intonation and rhythm that left no room for individual interpretation or expression. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval education was the complete suppression of curiosity and questioning. Students who asked why too often were quickly labeled as troublemakers or potential heretics. The goal wasn't to understand the material, but to reproduce it perfectly, to become human repositories of established knowledge rather than thinking individuals capable of building upon what they learned. The social dynamics within these schools created additional layers of stress and competition. Students were ranked not just academically, but socially, with those from noble families automatically accorded higher status regardless of their actual abilities. The children of merchants or artisans had to work twice as hard for half the recognition, while those destined for religious life occupied a complex middle ground between secular and sacred hierarchies. Bullying wasn't just tolerated in medieval schools, it was institutionalized. Older students were expected to discipline younger ones, often with a cruelty that served as preparation for the harsh realities of adult life. A boy who showed signs of homesickness, fear, or emotional sensitivity would quickly become a target for systematic torment designed to toughen him up for his future role in society. The older students, having survived years of this treatment themselves, often became the most ruthless enforcers of the system. They had learned that showing mercy was seen as weakness, that kindness was a luxury they couldn't afford if they wanted to maintain their own precarious positions within the school hierarchy. The result was a cycle of cruelty that perpetuated itself generation after generation. Teachers rarely intervened in student conflicts, viewing them as natural sorting mechanisms that separated the strong from the weak. A student who couldn't defend himself against bullying was considered unfit for the challenges of adult life, while those who fought back too aggressively might be seen as lacking proper Christian humility. Finding the right balance between submission and self-assertion was yet another impossible challenge that medieval students had to navigate without guidance. The dormitory arrangements were designed to eliminate any sense of personal space or individual identity. Boys would sleep 3 or 4 to a bed, often without adequate blankets even in the depths of winter. Personal possessions were minimal and had to be shared, creating additional opportunities for conflict and theft. Students learned to sleep lightly, always alert for potential threats from their roommates or nighttime inspections by teachers. Privacy for personal hygiene was virtually non-existent. Students bathed together in communal facilities, when bathing was permitted at all, and used shared latrines that offered no protection from observation or embarrassment. The message was clear. Individual modesty and personal boundaries were luxuries that had no place in the serious business of education. The psychological toll of living under constant surveillance and judgment was immense. Students developed a hypervigilant state that would follow many of them throughout their adult lives. They learned to monitor their own thoughts and behaviors obsessively, always wondering if they were meeting expectations or falling short of the impossible standards set by their teachers. Sleep itself became another area of control and deprivation. Students were awakened multiple times during the night for additional prayer sessions, and the total amount of rest they received was barely sufficient to maintain basic cognitive function. Chronic sleep deprivation was seen as character building, a way to teach young people that physical comfort was an obstacle to spiritual and intellectual development. The few recreational activities permitted were structured competitions rather than genuine play. Students might engage in formal debates, but these followed rigid rules and were judged on adherence to proper form rather than creativity or originality of thought. Physical exercise consisted mainly of walking in formation or performing simple calisthenics designed to maintain health rather than provide enjoyment or stress relief. Even meals became opportunities for discipline and control. Students ate in complete silence, their every bite monitored for signs of excessive enjoyment or insufficient gratitude. The food itself was deliberately bland and unappetizing, based on the belief that taking pleasure in eating was a form of gluttony. Students learned to view their own hunger and the basic human need for nourishing food as moral weaknesses to be overcome rather than natural requirements to be satisfied. The seasonal variations in food availability meant that students regularly faced genuine hunger, particularly in late winter when stored provisions ran low. Many developed the hollow-eyed, undernourished appearance that was actually considered a mark of serious scholarly dedication. Parents who visited during brief holidays were often shocked by their children's physical deterioration, but school administrators presented this as evidence of successful character development. Medical care was primitive and often counterproductive. Illness was frequently attributed to moral failings rather than physical causes. So sick students might find themselves subjected to additional prayers and punishments rather than actual treatment. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything from headaches to stomach ailments, often leaving already weakened students even more debilitated than before. The understanding of contagious diseases was virtually non-existent, so sick students continued to attend classes and share living spaces with healthy peers. Epidemics swept through schools regularly, claiming lives and disrupting education for months at a time. These tragedies were typically attributed to divine will rather than preventable conditions, and schools rarely modified their practices in response to health crises. Mental health issues, while not understood in modern terms, were clearly present among medieval students. The combination of harsh discipline, social isolation, academic pressure, and physical deprivation created conditions that would challenge even the most resilient adults. Students who experienced emotional breakdowns were typically seen as possessed by demons rather than victims of an abusive system. Some developed what we might now recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, repeatedly checking their work for errors or performing ritual actions to ward off punishment. Others became withdrawn and uncommunicative, going through the motions of academic life while emotionally shutting down completely. A few became aggressive or violent, lashing out at peers or teachers in desperate attempts to assert some control over their circumstances. The long-term psychological effects of this educational system were profound and lasting. Many medieval scholars emerged with remarkable intellectual abilities, but severely stunted emotional development. They could engage in complex theological debates and produce elegant Latin prose, but often struggled with basic human relationships and emotional expression throughout their adult lives. The authoritarian structure created adults who were either completely submissive to authority or rebelliously hostile to any form of control. There was little middle ground between these extremes, as the system provided no models for healthy independence or collaborative decision-making. Students learned to either dominate or submit, with few skills for genuine partnership or mutual respect. Yet somehow, against all odds, this harsh system occasionally produced individuals of extraordinary capability and vision. The very pressure that broke so many others seemed to forge a few into intellectual giants who would go on to make significant contributions to human knowledge and understanding. These exceptional individuals often credited their medieval education with teaching them discipline and mental toughness, though they rarely acknowledged the tremendous personal cost of acquiring these qualities. The irony is that many of the greatest advances in medieval learning came from scholars who had learned to think creatively despite their formal education rather than because of it. They had somehow managed to preserve their curiosity and intellectual flexibility while navigating a system designed to suppress both qualities. Their achievements stand as testimony not to the effectiveness of medieval educational methods, but to the resilience of the human spirit when faced with seemingly impossible obstacles. As the seasons turned and students progressed through their years of medieval schooling, those who survived the initial shock of the system faced new and increasingly complex challenges. The advanced students, typically boys who had endured 4 or 5 years of this educational gauntlet, found themselves thrust into studies that would make their earlier grammar lessons seem like gentle warm-ups. Logic, the second component of the trivium, was where many promising students finally met their match. This wasn't logic as we might understand it today, with its emphasis on clear reasoning and practical problem-solving. Medieval logic was a labyrinthine system of formal argumentation based on the works of Aristotle, filtered through centuries of Christian theological interpretation, and made deliberately obscure by generations of scholars who seemed to believe that difficulty was synonymous with profundity. Students would spend months memorizing the various forms of syllogisms, learning to construct arguments that followed prescribed patterns, regardless of whether those arguments made any practical sense. They would practice identifying logical fallacies while simultaneously being taught to accept certain fundamental premises that could never be questioned. The mental gymnastics required to navigate these contradictions left many students feeling as though their minds were being twisted into knots. A typical logic lesson might involve spending an entire morning debating whether angels could occupy the same space simultaneously, or how many demons could dance on the head of a pin. These weren't thought experiments designed to develop flexible thinking. They were rigid exercises in applying predetermined logical structures to increasingly absurd scenarios. Students who pointed out the apparent pointlessness of such debates were quickly reminded that questioning the curriculum was tantamount to questioning divine wisdom. The teaching methods for logic were particularly cruel because they required students to argue positions they might personally find repugnant or nonsensical. A boy might be forced to construct elaborate proofs for the superiority of warfare over peace, or to argue that slavery was divinely ordained, all while maintaining perfect logical form and hiding any personal discomfort with the positions he was defending. Public disputations became a regular feature of advanced education, with students required to defend assigned positions against aggressive questioning from their peers and teachers. These weren't collaborative discussions aimed at reaching greater understanding. They were intellectual blood sports where the goal was to humiliate opponents through superior command of logical technicalities rather than to engage with the substance of important questions. The pressure during these public debates was enormous. A student who faltered in his argumentation didn't just receive a poor grade. He faced public shame that could affect his standing within the school community for months or even years. Some students developed severe anxiety around these events, while others became so focused on winning debates that they lost sight of any genuine interest in the topics they were discussing. Rhetoric, the third component of the trivium, was perhaps even more psychologically demanding than logic because it required students to master the art of persuasion while simultaneously being taught that their own opinions and desires were irrelevant. Medieval rhetoric was based on classical Roman models, particularly the works of Cicero and Quintilian, but adapted to serve the needs of Christian society and its rigid hierarchical structures. Students learned to construct elaborate speeches following ancient formulas, with prescribed openings, developments, and conclusions that left little room for individual voice or authentic expression. They memorized hundreds of rhetorical devices and figures of speech, practicing until they could deploy them automatically without conscious thought. The goal was to become a kind of speaking machine, capable of producing eloquent discourse on any assigned topic, while revealing nothing of one's own personality or convictions. The subjects for rhetorical exercises were carefully chosen to reinforce orthodox thinking and social conformity. Students might be asked to compose a speech praising the virtues of obedience, or to construct an elaborate denunciation of pride and ambition. They learned to argue passionately for positions they had never been allowed to examine critically, developing a kind of intellectual schizophrenia that separated their public personas from any authentic inner life. The physical demands of rhetorical training were as exhausting as the mental ones. Students had to learn proper gesture, posture, and voice projection, spending hours practicing speeches while teachers critiqued every movement of their hands and every inflection of their voices. A slightly drooping shoulder or inadequately projected syllable could result in starting the entire speech over from the beginning, often multiple times until physical and mental exhaustion made further practice impossible. Memory work reached new levels of intensity in rhetorical training. Students were expected to memorize entire speeches, sometimes running to thousands of words, and to deliver them flawlessly without notes or prompts. The techniques for developing such prodigious memory skills were themselves demanding, requiring students to construct elaborate mental palaces and association systems that took months to master and constant practice to maintain. The quadrivium subjects presented their own unique torments. Arithmetic, already challenging with Roman numerals, became nightmarish when students advanced to more complex calculations. They learned to perform multiplication and division, using methods that required manipulating numbers through multiple intermediate steps, each of which had to be executed perfectly, or the entire calculation would produce incorrect results. The abacus became their primary computational tool, but mastering its use required developing almost superhuman dexterity and concentration. Advanced students could manipulate the beads with lightning speed, their fingers dancing across the frame while they kept track of multiple calculations simultaneously. The clicking and rattling of dozens of abacuses in use created a constant background noise that added to the already overwhelming sensory assault of medieval classroom environments. Word problems in medieval arithmetic were particularly frustrating because they often involved scenarios that had no connection to students' actual experiences or future needs. They might spend weeks calculating how to divide imaginary quantities of grain among hypothetical workers, or determining the optimal interest rates for loans they would never make to merchants they would never meet. The disconnect between academic exercise and practical reality was so complete that many students never understood how mathematical skills might actually be useful in daily life. Geometry advanced from basic memorization of Euclidean proofs to complex constructions that had to be executed with primitive tools on inadequate surfaces. Students worked with crude compasses made from metal or wood, trying to draw perfect circles on wax tablets that were often warped or damaged. Their straightedges were typically just flat pieces of wood or metal that might not actually be straight, leading to constructions that were doomed to failure before they began. The geometric proofs themselves became increasingly abstract and removed from any visual reality. Students learned to manipulate complex three-dimensional relationships entirely in their minds, without the benefit of models or detailed diagrams. They could recite lengthy proofs about spheres and polyhedra, while having never actually seen or handled objects of the shapes they were discussing. Advanced astronomy required students to memorize vast tables of planetary positions and celestial calculations without understanding the underlying principles that made such predictions possible. They learned to track the movements of heavenly bodies through complex mathematical formulas, while being simultaneously taught that questioning the theological significance of these movements was dangerous heresy. The astrolabe, when schools could afford such sophisticated instruments, became both a blessing and a curse for astronomy students. These intricate devices could perform amazing calculations and predictions, but learning to use them properly required months of practice and an understanding of mathematical relationships that few students ever truly grasped. Many simply memorized the mechanical steps needed to operate the instrument without comprehending the principles that made it work. Music theory in advanced medieval education bore little resemblance to what we might call musical training. Students learned complex systems for categorizing and analyzing different modes and scales, memorizing relationships between mathematical ratios and musical intervals that had been established by ancient Greek theorists. They could discourse learnedly about the mathematical properties of harmony while being unable to carry a simple tune or play a basic melody. The notation system for Gregorian chant became increasingly complex as students advanced, with subtle variations in neum shapes indicating precise vocal techniques that took years to master. Students spent countless hours learning to recognize and reproduce minute differences in musical ornaments and inflections, developing the kind of technical precision that left little room for musical expression or enjoyment. Advanced students were also introduced to the art of musical composition, but this followed rigid rules that eliminated any possibility of creativity or personal expression. They learned to construct melodies according to strict mathematical formulas, ensuring that every note followed predetermined patterns of consonance and dissonance. The resulting compositions were technically correct, but emotionally sterile, reflecting the broader medieval preference for conformity over innovation. The social pressures on advanced students were particularly intense because they were now seen as potential leaders and representatives of their institutions. Every mistake they made reflected not just on themselves, but on their teachers and schools, creating additional layers of scrutiny and expectation that made the already stressful environment even more difficult to navigate. Advanced students were often given teaching responsibilities for younger pupils, But they received no training in pedagogy or child development. They were simply expected to reproduce the harsh methods that had been used on them, perpetuating cycles of cruelty and fear that might have been broken with more thoughtful approaches to education. Many struggled with the moral implications of inflicting on others the same suffering they had endured, but questioning the system was not an option. The transition from student to teacher was abrupt and jarring. One day a boy might be cowering under the threat of the birch rod, and the next he might be expected to wield it himself against children who reminded him of his own younger self. This sudden reversal of roles created psychological conflicts that many never successfully resolved, leading to adults who were either excessively harsh or paralyzingly indecisive when placed in positions of authority. The academic calendar for advanced students became even more demanding, with longer hours and fewer breaks as they progressed through their studies. What little free time they had been allowed as beginners was gradually eliminated, replaced by additional study periods, extra assignments, and increased expectations for independent learning. The message was clear. The closer you came to completing your education, the less you deserved any consideration for your comfort or well-being. Sleep deprivation reached dangerous levels among advanced students, who were expected to rise even earlier for additional prayer sessions and stay up later completing complex assignments. Many developed the hollow-eyed, gaunt appearance that was considered a mark of serious scholarship, though it was actually evidence of systematic physical and mental abuse disguised as educational rigor. The few students who managed to complete this advanced curriculum emerged as fundamentally different people than they had been when they entered the system. They possessed remarkable intellectual skills and could engage in complex academic discourse with impressive facility, but they had paid an enormous personal price for these abilities. Many had lost the capacity for spontaneous joy, creative thinking, or genuine emotional connection with others. The irony of medieval education becomes most apparent when examining its ultimate products. The system was designed to create learned men who could serve the church and state, and by that narrow measure, it often succeeded. But the cost in human terms was staggering, and the broader implications for society were profound. An educational system that systematically crushed curiosity, creativity, and individual expression inevitably produced a culture that was resistant to change, innovation, and progress. Yet within this oppressive framework, some extraordinary individuals managed not just to survive, but to transcend their circumstances. These rare students somehow preserved their intellectual independence and creative spark, despite years of systematic attempts to eliminate both qualities. Their achievements stand as testimony to the resilience of human nature when faced with seemingly impossible obstacles. The medieval classroom, with all its harshness and limitations, was ultimately a reflection of the broader society that created it. In a world where hierarchy was considered divinely ordained, where questioning authority was dangerous, and where individual desires were seen as obstacles to social order, educational methods that emphasized submission and conformity made perfect sense. The tragedy is that so much human potential was wasted in service of these rigid ideals. As we drift toward the conclusion of our exploration into medieval education, it becomes clear that what we've been examining isn't just a historical curiosity, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of educational systems that prioritize control over development, conformity over creativity, and institutional needs over individual growth. The children who endured these schools were not just students, but casualties of a system that valued order above all else, including the well-being of those it claimed to serve. The lasting impact of medieval educational methods extended far beyond the classroom walls, shaping entire generations of adults who had learned to suppress their natural curiosity and creativity in favor of rigid adherence to established patterns. These individuals went on to become teachers, leaders, and decision-makers who perpetuated the very systems that had damaged them, creating cycles of intellectual and emotional limitation that would persist for centuries. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not just how far educational practices have evolved, but how important it is to remain vigilant against any tendency to prioritize institutional convenience over student welfare. The medieval classroom serves as a stark reminder that education can be either a force for human development and liberation, or a tool for control and suppression, depending on the values and priorities of those who design and implement it. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed with its soft sheets and warm blankets, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those long-ago children who shivered on their straw mattresses, their minds full of Latin verbs and mathematical formulas, their bodies aching from hours of sitting on hard wooden benches, their spirits slowly being moulded into shapes that serve society's needs rather than their own dreams and aspirations. The physical toll of medieval education extended beyond mere discomfort into realms that would horrify modern child welfare advocates. By the time students reached their final years of study, their bodies bore the permanent marks of their scholarly journey. Spines curved from years of hunching over wax tablets and manuscripts, eyes strained and weakened from reading by candlelight, hands gnarled from gripping styluses and quills in cold chambers where ink would sometimes freeze in the wells. The repetitive stress injuries that plagued medieval students were accepted as natural consequences of serious learning. Boys developed what we might now recognize as carpal tunnel syndrome from endless hours of copying texts, their wrists swollen and painful from the constant motion of transcription. The crude writing instruments of the era, lacking any ergonomic consideration, forced students into unnatural hand positions that caused permanent damage over time. Respiratory problems were endemic in medieval schools, where poorly ventilated chambers filled with smoke from tallow candles and oil lamps created a perpetual haze that burned lungs and throats. Students developed chronic coughs that echoed through the corridors like a sad chorus, their voices becoming permanently hoarse from years of reciting lessons in rooms thick with acrid air. The combination of cold, damp conditions and constant exposure to smoke created the perfect environment for lung ailments that would plague scholars throughout their shortened lives. Malnutrition manifested in ways that went far beyond simple hunger. Students' teeth would loosen and fall out from scurvy, their gums bleeding during recitations as they struggled to pronounce Latin consonants with mouths that had forgotten how to properly function. Their hair became brittle and thin. Their skin took on a greyish pallor that was actually celebrated as evidence of scholarly dedication rather than recognized as a symptom of systematic neglect. The skeletal development of medieval students was permanently altered by their educational experience. Years of carrying heavy tablets and manuscripts, combined with inadequate nutrition and constant stress, resulted in stunted growth and malformed bones. Many graduates of medieval schools were noticeably shorter and more frail than their contemporaries, who had spent their youth in manual labor, their bodies bearing witness to the physical cost of intellectual pursuit. But perhaps most disturbing was the way these physical ailments were incorporated into the mythology of medieval scholarship. Teachers would point to particularly gaunt or sickly students as examples of proper dedication, suggesting that those who maintained healthy appearances were somehow less committed to their studies. The equation of suffering with learning became so deeply embedded in medieval educational philosophy that comfort itself was viewed with suspicion. The seasonal cycles brought their own particular torments. Winter in medieval schools was an endurance test that claimed the lives of weaker students with shocking regularity. The stone buildings that housed these institutions were designed more like fortresses than schools, with thick walls that kept out invaders, but also trapped cold air that seemed to seep into students' bones and never leave. Ice would form on the interior walls of dormitories, and students would wake to find their breath frozen on their blankets. Heating was minimal and carefully controlled, based on the belief that physical comfort interfered with mental discipline. A small brazier might be lit in the main classroom, but students had to crowd around it during brief breaks, jostling for position while teachers watched to ensure no one lingered too long in the warmth. The lucky few closest to the fire would feel one side of their bodies thaw, while the other remained numb with cold, creating a peculiar sensation that became as familiar as hunger. Spring brought different challenges as the schools transformed into breeding grounds for disease. The close quarters that had provided some protection from winter's bite became petri dishes, where illness spread with terrifying speed. Students who had survived the cold months often succumbed to fevers and infections that swept through dormitories like wildfire, their weakened immune systems unable to cope with the sudden change in conditions. Summer, theoretically the most pleasant season, was actually dreaded by many students because it meant the return of fleas, lice, and other parasites that had remained dormant during the coldest months. The same thick walls that trapped cold in winter now trapped heat and humidity, creating stifling conditions that made concentration nearly impossible. Students would sit in pools of their own sweat while reciting lengthy passages, their clothing sticking to wooden benches that became instruments of torture in the oppressive heat. The academic pressure intensified rather than diminished as students progressed through their years of schooling. Advanced pupils were expected to demonstrate not just mastery of their subjects, but the ability to teach others, engage in complex disputations, and produce original works that showed proper understanding of established authorities. The definition of original in this context was peculiarly medieval. Students were expected to create new combinations of existing ideas without ever actually challenging or questioning the fundamental premises they were working with. Thesis defenses became elaborate public spectacles, where students stood before panels of masters and fellow pupils to defend positions they might have spent months preparing. These events were designed as intellectual combat rather than scholarly discourse, with questioners seeking to expose weaknesses and contradictions that would humiliate the candidate. The psychological pressure was enormous, made worse by the knowledge that failure would mean years of additional study or complete dismissal from the academic community. The oral nature of these examinations created additional stress for students who had spent years primarily engaged in written work. They had to learn to think on their feet, to respond to aggressive questioning without the comfort of reference materials, and to maintain composure while being systematically attacked by individuals who had undergone the same brutal process themselves and were eager to inflict similar suffering on the next generation. The language requirements became increasingly complex as students advanced. While basic instruction had focused on Latin grammar and vocabulary, advanced students were expected to demonstrate mastery of different registers and styles, appropriate to various contexts. They learned to write in the elaborate cursive scripts reserved for formal documents, to compose poetry according to ancient meters, and to deliver speeches using rhetorical techniques that had been refined over centuries of academic tradition. But this linguistic sophistication came at the cost of emotional expression and authentic communication. Students learned to hide their true thoughts behind layers of formal language, to express even their most personal experiences in terms borrowed from classical authors, and to view their own voices as crude instruments, unworthy of serious discourse. Many graduates of medieval schools never recovered the ability to speak simply and directly about their own experiences, having been trained to see authentic self-expression as a mark of intellectual poverty. The library systems in medieval schools reflected the broader authoritarian philosophy that governed every aspect of educational life. Books were chained to desks or shelves, not just to prevent theft, but to symbolize the idea that knowledge itself was imprisoned and could only be accessed under strict supervision. Students had to request permission to examine specific texts, and their reading was carefully monitored to ensure they weren't encountering ideas that might challenge orthodox thinking. The manuscripts themselves were objects of reverence that students were taught to handle with an almost religious awe. Many books were considered too precious for student use, available only to masters or advanced scholars who had proven their worthiness through years of submission and conformity. The few texts that students were allowed to examine were often incomplete or heavily annotated with approved interpretations that guided readers toward predetermined conclusions. Copying manuscripts remained one of the primary methods of instruction throughout a student's career, but the work became increasingly demanding as they progressed. Advanced students might spend months creating single copies of important works, laboring over every letter and illustration, with the knowledge that errors could result in the destruction of weeks or months of work. The psychological pressure of this perfectionism created a generation of scholars who were paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. The illumination of manuscripts, when students were permitted to attempt such work, required artistic skills that were never formally taught, but were expected to emerge through trial and error. Students had to learn to mix pigments, prepare gold leaf, and execute complex decorative designs while working in poor light, with inadequate tools. Many attempts resulted in ruined pages and severe punishments, but occasionally a student would produce work of such beauty that it justified, in the minds of teachers, all the suffering that had preceded it. The theological implications of every aspect of medieval education became more apparent as students advanced in their studies. Even subjects that might seem purely secular, like mathematics or astronomy, were taught within frameworks that emphasized divine order and cosmic hierarchy. Students learned that questioning the mathematical relationships that governed celestial movements was tantamount to questioning God's design of the universe. Natural philosophy, the precursor to what we would call science, was particularly constrained by religious doctrine. Students could observe and describe natural phenomena, but they were forbidden from developing explanations that contradicted established theological teachings. This created a peculiar form of intellectual schizophrenia, where students learned to separate observation from interpretation, developing detailed knowledge of how things worked while remaining ignorant of why they worked that way. The study of medicine, when it was available at all, exemplified this tension between empirical observation and religious authority. Students might learn to identify symptoms and apply traditional remedies, but they were taught that illness was ultimately a manifestation of spiritual corruption rather than physical dysfunction. This theological framework made genuine medical progress nearly impossible, as treatments focused more on prayer and penance than on understanding disease processes. Legal studies presented similar challenges, as students had to master complex systems of civil and canon law, while understanding that ultimate justice came from divine rather than human sources. They learned to argue cases and interpret statutes with sophisticated reasoning, but always within the constraint that human law was subordinate to religious authority. This created lawyers and judges who were technically competent, but philosophically limited, capable of administering existing systems, but incapable of imagining fundamental reforms. The transition from student to professional life was often more traumatic than families anticipated. Young men who had spent years in the artificial environment of medieval schools found themselves unprepared for the practical demands of careers in law, medicine, or administration. They possessed impressive theoretical knowledge, but lacked the social skills and emotional resilience needed to navigate complex adult relationships and responsibilities. Many graduates experienced what we might now recognize as a form of culture shock, as they left the rigid structure of school life and encountered the messier realities of the world beyond academic walls. Some retreated into religious communities that provided familiar routines and hierarchies, while others struggled to adapt their scholarly training to practical applications that their education had never adequately prepared them for. The psychological legacy of medieval education followed its survivors throughout their lives, shaping their approaches to problem-solving, relationships, and personal growth. Having learned to suppress curiosity and creativity in favor of conformity and submission, many found it difficult to adapt to situations that required innovation or independent thinking. They had been trained to follow established patterns rather than to develop new solutions to emerging problems. The family relationships of medieval school graduates were often strained by the emotional distance that their education had created. Having learned to suppress their feelings and to view emotional expression as weakness, many struggled to form intimate bonds with spouses and children. They reproduced in their own families the authoritarian patterns that had shaped their own development, creating cycles of emotional deprivation that could persist for generations. Yet somehow, within this oppressive system, sparks of genuine brilliance occasionally emerged. A few exceptional individuals managed to preserve their intellectual curiosity and creative potential despite years of systematic attempts to eliminate both qualities. These rare scholars went on to make contributions that advanced human knowledge and understanding, often by finding ways to work within the constraints of their time, while subtly pushing against its boundaries. The works produced by medieval scholars reflect both the limitations and the possibilities of their educational system. Their writings demonstrate remarkable technical skill and deep knowledge of classical sources, but they also reveal the intellectual constraints that prevented most from making genuinely original contributions. The best medieval scholarship represents a kind of magnificent synthesis of existing knowledge rather than the creation of fundamentally new understanding. The artistic and literary achievements of the medieval period similarly reflect the tensions between creativity and conformity that characterized the educational system. Illuminated manuscripts, cathedral architecture, and courtly literature reached heights of technical perfection that remain impressive today, but they did so within strictly defined parameters that limited innovation and personal expression. The gradual evolution of medieval educational practices reflected broader changes in European society as economic growth, urbanization, and contact with other cultures began to challenge traditional assumptions about learning and knowledge. New universities that emerged in the later medieval period began to experiment with different approaches to instruction, though they remained constrained by many of the same philosophical and practical limitations that had shaped earlier schools. The introduction of new texts, particularly works of classical philosophy and science that had been preserved in Islamic libraries, began to create pressure for educational reform. Students who encountered these materials often found themselves torn between the excitement of new ideas and the fear of challenging established authorities. Some managed to integrate new knowledge into existing frameworks, while others found their faith in traditional teachings fundamentally shaken. The invention of printing, though it occurred near the end of the medieval period, began to transform educational practices by making books more widely available and reducing the emphasis on memorization and copying. Students who had access to printed materials could spend more time analyzing and discussing ideas rather than simply reproducing them, creating possibilities for more dynamic and interactive forms of learning. But change came slowly and unevenly across medieval Europe, and many schools continued to operate according to traditional methods long after alternatives became available. The conservative nature of educational institutions, combined with their close ties to religious authorities who were suspicious of innovation, meant that reform often met with resistance from those who had invested their lives in existing systems. The legacy of medieval education extended far beyond the medieval period itself, influencing educational practices and philosophical assumptions about learning that persisted well into the modern era. The emphasis on discipline, memorization, and submission to authority that characterized medieval schools continued to shape educational thinking for centuries, creating institutional cultures that prioritize control over development and conformity over creativity. Understanding this history helps us appreciate both how far educational practices have evolved and how important it is to remain vigilant against tendencies to prioritize institutional needs over student welfare. The medieval classroom serves as a powerful reminder that education can serve either as a force for human liberation and growth, or as a mechanism for social control and intellectual suppression, depending on the values and priorities that guide its implementation. As we reach toward the end of our journey through the harsh corridors of medieval learning, we're left with a profound appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic oppression. The children who endured these schools were not just students, but survivors of an educational system that viewed them as raw material to be shaped according to predetermined specifications, rather than as individuals with inherent worth and potential. Their stories remind us that behind every historical system, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully designed, are real human beings whose lives are shaped by the choices made by those in positions of authority. The medieval approach to education, with all its limitations and cruelties, was not the product of deliberate malice, but of deeply held beliefs about human nature, social order, and the relationship between suffering and growth. Yet within this framework of constraint and control, we find examples of human dignity, intellectual achievement, and moral courage that inspire us even across the centuries. The few who manage to preserve their humanity and creativity, despite systematic attempts to eliminate both qualities, serve as reminders that the human spirit, while it can be bent and shaped by external forces, cannot ultimately be broken by them. The final examinations that concluded a medieval student's academic journey were ordeals that would make modern standardized testing look like gentle afternoon quizzes. These weren't simply assessments of knowledge. They were elaborate rituals of intellectual combat designed to test not just what students had learned, but their ability to perform under the most extreme psychological pressure imaginable. Picture, if you will, a young man who had survived 6 or 7 years of medieval schooling, his body bearing the physical marks of his educational journey, his mind crammed with Latin texts and theological arguments, standing before a panel of masters who viewed his examination not as an opportunity to celebrate his achievement, but as a final chance to ensure he had been properly broken and rebuilt according to their specifications. The examination hall itself was designed to intimidate. High stone walls rose around a central space where the candidate stood alone, surrounded by tiers of seats filled with masters, advanced students, and sometimes even members of the local nobility who attended these intellectual spectacles for entertainment. The acoustics were deliberately harsh, ensuring that every stumble, every hesitation, every sign of nervousness would be amplified and heard by the entire assembly. The questions came without warning or mercy. A master might begin by asking the candidate to recite lengthy passages from memory, testing not just his knowledge, but his ability to perform flawlessly under intense scrutiny. A single, mispronounced word or forgotten phrase could result in immediate failure and the humiliation of being dismissed before the assembled crowd. But memorization was only the beginning. The real test came when masters began posing complex theological or philosophical problems that required the candidate to demonstrate his ability to think within the rigid parameters of medieval scholastic method. These weren't open-ended questions designed to encourage creative thinking. They were elaborate traps where every possible answer had been predetermined, and the candidate's task was to find the single correct path through a maze of logical possibilities. The masters took particular delight in presenting paradoxes and contradictions that seemed to have no satisfactory resolution. A candidate might be asked to reconcile conflicting statements from different church fathers, or to explain how free will could coexist with divine omniscience. These questions weren't meant to be answered so much as navigated, requiring the candidate to demonstrate his mastery of approved theological techniques while avoiding the numerous pitfalls that could brand him as a heretic. The psychological pressure was compounded by the knowledge that failure meant not just academic disappointment, but potential social and economic ruin. A young man who failed his final examinations might find himself barred from pursuing any of the careers that required formal education, condemned to return to his family in disgrace, with years of sacrifice and investment rendered worthless. Some candidates cracked under this pressure, their minds simply shutting down in the face of impossible demands and hostile scrutiny. Others became so focused on avoiding mistakes that they lost the ability to think clearly, their responses becoming increasingly convoluted and self-contradictory as they tried to anticipate and deflect potential criticisms. The few who succeeded did so not through superior intelligence or creativity, but through their ability to perform like trained animals, reproducing approved responses with mechanical precision while giving no hint of independent thought or personal opinion. They had learned to make themselves intellectually invisible, to become perfect vessels for transmitting established knowledge without contaminating it with their own perspectives. Those who emerged victorious from this ordeal were forever changed by the experience. They had proven their ability to function within the system, but at the cost of surrendering much of what made them human. They became the next generation of teachers and administrators, perpetuating the very methods that had shaped them so harshly. The graduation ceremonies that followed successful examinations were curious affairs that mixed celebration with continued intimidation. New graduates were presented with their credentials amid great pomp and ceremony, but they were also subjected to elaborate oaths and pledges that bound them to maintain the traditions and methods of their schools. They were reminded, even in their moment of triumph, that their education was not an achievement to be proud of, but a responsibility to be carried with humility and fear. The transition from student to professional life brought its own unique challenges. Young men who had spent their formative years in the artificial environment of medieval schools often found themselves unprepared for the complexities and ambiguities of life beyond academic walls. They possessed impressive theoretical knowledge, but lacked the practical skills and emotional intelligence needed to navigate adult relationships and responsibilities. Many graduates experienced a form of reverse culture shock as they left the structured world of school and encountered the messier realities of professional practice. Lawyers trained in elaborate theoretical frameworks struggled to deal with clients whose problems didn't fit neatly into academic categories. Physicians educated in ancient medical texts found themselves helpless when confronted with actual sick people whose symptoms didn't match classical descriptions. The clergy, which absorbed many graduates of medieval schools, often struggled with the gap between their theological training and the pastoral needs of ordinary people. They could deliver learned sermons on complex doctrinal points, but had difficulty providing comfort to grieving families or guidance to individuals facing moral dilemmas that weren't addressed in their textbooks. Some graduates retreated into academic careers, becoming teachers themselves and finding safety in the familiar rhythms of school life. They reproduced the methods that had shaped them, not out of conviction that these methods were effective, but because they knew no alternatives and feared the consequences of experimentation or innovation. Others found ways to adapt their formal education to practical needs, gradually developing the skills and insights that their schooling had failed to provide. These individuals often became the most effective professionals of their generation, combining theoretical knowledge with hard-won practical experience in ways that their purely academic colleagues could never match. The long-term effects of medieval education extended far beyond individual careers and into the broader patterns of European intellectual and cultural development. The emphasis on authority, tradition, and conformity that characterized medieval schools created generations of educated elites who were deeply conservative in their thinking and resistant to change or innovation. This intellectual conservatism had profound implications for European society's ability to respond to new challenges and opportunities. When confronted with new ideas from other cultures, technological innovations, or changing social conditions, educated Europeans often reacted with suspicion and hostility rather than curiosity and openness. The rigid hierarchical thinking that medieval education fostered also reinforced existing social and political structures, making it difficult for societies to adapt to changing circumstances or to address systemic problems that required new approaches. The very people who might have been expected to provide intellectual leadership often became obstacles to necessary reforms. Yet within this context of intellectual limitation and social rigidity, some remarkable achievements did emerge. The cathedral schools and early universities of medieval Europe, despite their harsh methods and narrow curricula, did succeed in preserving and transmitting much of the classical heritage that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent centuries following the fall of Rome. The scholarly traditions that developed in medieval schools, while constraining in many ways, also created frameworks for systematic inquiry and debate that would eventually evolve into more open and productive forms of intellectual engagement. The very techniques of logical analysis and textual interpretation that were used to maintain orthodox thinking would later be turned against established authorities by reformers and innovators. The manuscripts copied by countless generations of suffering students preserved not just religious texts, but works of philosophy, science, and literature that would inspire later generations of scholars who had access to better educational methods and broader intellectual horizons. The patient, meticulous work of medieval scribes and students created the foundation upon which Renaissance humanists would build their more dynamic and creative approaches to learning. The institutional structures developed by medieval schools, despite their many flaws, established patterns of organization and administration that would be refined and improved by later educators. The idea that education should be systematic, sequential, and comprehensive, while often implemented in harmful ways during the medieval period, would eventually evolve into more humane and effective approaches to instruction. The Latin literacy that medieval schools so painfully instilled in their students created a common intellectual language that allowed scholars from different regions and backgrounds to communicate and collaborate across cultural and political boundaries. This shared linguistic foundation would prove crucial to the development of European intellectual networks and the eventual emergence of truly international scholarly communities. Even the harsh discipline and demanding standards that characterize medieval education, while often excessive and counterproductive, did instill in some students a work ethic and intellectual rigor that served them well throughout their lives. The few who emerged from this system without having their spirits completely crushed often possessed remarkable powers of concentration, memory, and analytical thinking. The theological focus of medieval education, while limiting in many ways, also created generations of thinkers who were deeply engaged with fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the relationship between reason and faith. These concerns would continue to shape European intellectual life long after the medieval period ended, contributing to ongoing debates about ethics, politics, and the nature of knowledge itself. As we near the end of our exploration of medieval educational practices, it becomes clear that what we've been examining is not just a historical curiosity, but a complex system that reflected the values, assumptions, and limitations of its time, while also shaping the future in ways that its creators could never have imagined. The children who endured medieval schools were both victims and agents of historical change, suffering under harsh conditions while also participating in the preservation and transmission of knowledge that would eventually contribute to more enlightened approaches to learning and human development. Their experiences remind us that education is never neutral or objective, but always reflects the priorities and beliefs of those who design and implement it. The medieval approach to schooling, with its emphasis on authority, conformity, and suffering, produced certain kinds of results while foreclosing other possibilities, just as our own educational systems both enable and constrain human potential in ways we may not fully understand. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the importance of remaining vigilant about the values and assumptions that guide our own educational practices. The harsh lessons of medieval schooling serve as a reminder that the methods we use to educate young people have profound and lasting consequences, not just for individual students, but for the broader trajectory of human civilization. The children who once sat on those hard wooden benches, shivering in cold classrooms while struggling to memorize Latin verbs and theological arguments, were not so different from the students in our own schools today. They had the same capacity for wonder, creativity, and growth that characterizes young people in every generation. The tragedy of medieval education was not that it failed to recognize this potential, but that it systematically worked to suppress and redirect it according to the narrow needs of a rigid social order. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed with its soft pillows and warm blankets, perhaps you'll think of those long-ago students who huddled on their straw mattresses, their minds churning with memorized texts, and their bodies aching from the day's harsh lessons. Their suffering was not meaningless, for it contributed to the slow, painful process by which humanity learns to create more humane and effective ways of nurturing its young. The story of medieval education is ultimately a story about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic oppression, and about the gradual recognition that true learning requires not the breaking of young minds, but their careful cultivation in environments that honor both their need for structure and their capacity for growth. The few graduates who managed to survive this educational gauntlet carried with them scars both visible and invisible, marks of an experience that had fundamentally altered not just their minds, but their very souls. They walked differently than other men, these scholars, with a particular kind of careful precision that spoke of years spent navigating environments where a single misstep could bring swift and painful consequences. Their handwriting, when they took quill to parchment in their professional lives, bore the unmistakable characteristics of medieval training. Every letter was formed with obsessive uniformity, every word spaced with mathematical precision, every line ruler straight, despite the absence of guides. They could not write casually or quickly. Their hands had been trained to move in specific ways, and decades of habit made spontaneous expression nearly impossible. But perhaps most telling were the ways these men responded to authority and hierarchy throughout their adult lives. Having learned to read the subtlest shifts in a master's mood, to anticipate punishment before it arrived, to navigate complex social dynamics where a misplaced word could mean the difference between advancement and disgrace, they developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to power structures and social positioning. In their professional careers, whether as lawyers arguing cases before magistrates, physicians treating noble patients, or clerics delivering sermons to congregations, these graduates exhibited a peculiar combination of intellectual confidence and emotional timidity. They could engage in complex theological debates with impressive sophistication, but they often struggled with the simple human interactions that their formal education had never addressed. Marriage presented particular challenges for men whose formative years had been spent in all-male institutions, where emotional expression was systematically suppressed. Many found it difficult to form intimate bonds with their wives, having learned to view emotional vulnerability as a dangerous weakness. They might provide well for their families and conduct themselves with proper dignity in social situations. But the kind of warmth and spontaneity that characterizes healthy relationships often remained beyond their reach. Their relationships with their own children were frequently complicated by their educational experiences. Some graduates became excessively harsh disciplinarians, reproducing in their homes the rigid authoritarian structures that had shaped their own youth. Others swung to the opposite extreme, becoming overly permissive out of a conscious rejection of the methods that had caused them such suffering. The lucky few who found some middle ground often did so through painful trial and error, gradually learning to distinguish between the genuinely valuable aspects of their education and the unnecessary cruelties that had accompanied them. These men sometimes became advocates for educational reform, though they had to be careful not to challenge established practices too directly. The intellectual habits instilled by medieval education proved both blessing and curse in professional life. The ability to memorize vast amounts of information and recall it precisely was genuinely useful in an age before widespread literacy and readily available books. Lawyers who could quote entire legal codes from memory, physicians who knew classical medical texts by heart, and clerics who could recite scripture without hesitation possessed practical advantages that served them well in their careers. But this same emphasis on memorization and reproduction often came at the expense of analytical thinking and creative problem-solving. When confronted with novel situations that didn't fit established patterns, many graduates found themselves at a loss. They had been trained to apply predetermined solutions to familiar problems, not to develop new approaches to unprecedented challenges. The theological framework that had shaped their education continued to influence their thinking in all areas of life. Even when dealing with purely secular matters, they tended to approach problems through hierarchical structures and appeal to established authorities, rather than relying on empirical observation or innovative reasoning. This created a peculiar form of intellectual sophistication that was simultaneously impressive and limiting. Some of the most successful graduates were those who managed to supplement their formal education with practical experience gained through apprenticeships, travel, or exposure to different cultural traditions. These individuals learned to combine the theoretical knowledge they had acquired in school with more flexible approaches to problem solving that they developed through real-world application. The urban environment of later medieval Europe provided more opportunities for such intellectual cross-pollination than the rural settings where many schools were located. Graduates who found themselves working in bustling commercial centres were exposed to ideas and methods that challenged some of the assumptions of their formal training, leading to gradual modifications in their thinking and practice. Trade relationships with distant regions brought contact with scholars and practitioners from different educational traditions, creating opportunities for intellectual exchange that could broaden perspectives and introduce new approaches to familiar problems. Some graduates became important conduits for the transmission of knowledge between different cultural groups, using their linguistic skills and scholarly training to facilitate communication and collaboration. The rise of universities in the later medieval period reflected both the limitations of earlier educational methods and the growing demand for more sophisticated and flexible forms of higher learning. These new institutions, while still constrained by many traditional assumptions, began to experiment with different approaches to instruction and scholarship. The introduction of dialectical methods that encouraged structured debate and argumentation represented a significant departure from the purely authoritarian approaches that had characterized earlier schools. Students were still expected to work within established frameworks and respect traditional authorities, but they were given more opportunities to engage actively with ideas rather than simply memorizing and reproducing them. The emergence of new fields of study, particularly in areas related to natural philosophy and practical arts, reflected changing social and economic conditions that created demand for different kinds of knowledge and skills. Universities began offering instruction in subjects that had little precedent in traditional curricula, requiring the development of new pedagogical methods and institutional structures. These changes occurred gradually and unevenly across different regions and institutions, with some schools clinging to traditional methods long after alternatives had proven their effectiveness elsewhere. The conservative nature of educational establishments, combined with their close ties to religious authorities who were suspicious of innovation, meant that reform often met with significant resistance. But change did come, driven by the practical needs of an increasingly complex society and the intellectual curiosity of scholars who had been exposed to new ideas through trade, travel, and contact with other cultures. The harsh methods of early medieval education began to give way to approaches that, while still demanding and rigorous, placed greater emphasis on understanding and application rather than mere memorization and submission. The printing revolution, which began near the end of the medieval period, accelerated these changes by making books more widely available and reducing the emphasis on copying and memorization that had characterized earlier instruction. Students who had access to printed materials could spend more time analyzing and discussing ideas rather than laboriously reproducing them by hand. This technological innovation also democratized access to knowledge in ways that challenged traditional hierarchies and assumptions about who deserved education and what forms that education should take. Books could now be owned by individuals rather than institutions, creating possibilities for private study and independent scholarship that had been virtually impossible under earlier conditions. The gradual recognition that harsh discipline and systematic suffering were not necessary components of effective education represented one of the most important intellectual advances of the later medieval period. Some educators began to experiment with more humane methods, discovering that students could learn more effectively in environments that supported rather than suppressed their natural curiosity and creativity. These early educational reformers faced significant challenges from traditional authorities who viewed any departure from established methods with suspicion and hostility. Change came slowly and often had to be disguised as preservation of tradition rather than presented as innovation or improvement. But the seeds of more enlightened approaches to education had been planted, and they would eventually grow into educational philosophies and practices that recognize the inherent dignity and potential of young people, rather than viewing them as raw material to be shaped according to predetermined specifications. The legacy of medieval education extended far beyond the medieval period itself, influencing educational thinking and practice for centuries to come. Many of the assumptions about learning, discipline, and the relationship between teacher and student that were developed during this period persisted well into the modern era, creating institutional cultures that continue to prioritize control and conformity over development and creativity. Understanding this history helps us appreciate both how far educational practices have evolved and how important it remains to examine critically the methods and assumptions that guide our own approaches to teaching and learning. The medieval classroom serves as a powerful reminder that education can serve either as a force for human liberation and growth, or as a mechanism for social control and intellectual limitation. The children who once sat on those hard wooden benches, struggling to master Latin verbs while their bodies ached from cold and hunger, were not fundamentally different from students today. They possessed the same capacity for wonder, creativity, and intellectual growth that characterizes young people in every generation. What differed was not their potential, but the methods used to develop or suppress that potential. Their experiences remind us that behind every educational system, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully designed, are real human beings whose lives are profoundly shaped by the choices made by those in positions of authority. The medieval approach to education, with all its limitations and cruelties, was not the product of deliberate malice, but of deeply held beliefs about human nature, social order, and the relationship between suffering and moral development. Yet even within this harsh framework, we find examples of human resilience, intellectual achievement, and moral courage that inspire us across the centuries. The few who managed to preserve their humanity and creativity, despite systematic attempts to eliminate both qualities, serve as reminders that the human spirit, while it can be shaped by external forces, cannot ultimately be destroyed by them. As we drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps we can find some comfort in knowing that the long, painful evolution of human educational practices has brought us to a point where we recognize, at least in principle, that true learning requires not the breaking of young spirits, but their careful nurturing in environments that honor both their need for structure and their capacity for growth and self-expression. The monastery bells that once summoned medieval students to their dawn prayers have long since fallen silent, but their echoes remind us of a time when education was viewed as a form of spiritual and intellectual warfare rather than a collaborative journey of discovery. We have traveled far from those cold stone classrooms, though perhaps not as far as we might hope, and the journey toward truly humane and effective educational practices continues with each new generation of students and teachers who dare to imagine better ways of learning and growing together. In the quiet of this evening, as we prepare to rest, we can honor the memory of those long-ago children who suffered so much in pursuit of knowledge, while also celebrating the gradual recognition that learning flourishes best not in environments of fear and pain, but in spaces filled with curiosity, compassion, and genuine respect for the magnificent potential that resides within every young mind waiting to unfold. The shadows lengthen now as our journey through these medieval halls draws to its close. We've walked together through corridors where children once trembled at dawn bells, sat on benches that seemed designed more for penance than learning, and witnessed an educational system that confused cruelty with character building in ways that would horrify any modern parent or teacher. What strikes me most, as we prepare to leave these cold stone classrooms behind, is how the very definition of childhood was so fundamentally different in medieval times. These weren't children as we understand them today, with their rights to play, to question, to make mistakes without facing physical punishment. They were viewed instead as miniature adults, whose natural impulses needed to be systematically crushed before they could be rebuilt according to the rigid specifications of medieval society. The tragic irony of medieval education becomes most apparent when we consider its ultimate goals. These schools were designed to create learned men who could serve God and King, to preserve knowledge and maintain social order. Yet the methods they employed often achieved the opposite effect, crushing the very curiosity and creativity that might have led to genuine wisdom and beneficial innovation. Think about it. These educators believed so firmly in the value of suffering that they created institutions where physical pain, emotional deprivation, and psychological intimidation were seen as essential components of learning. They confused discipline with brutality, respect with fear, and education with indoctrination. The result was a system that could produce scholars of impressive technical ability while simultaneously destroying much of what made them human. The students who survived this educational gauntlet emerged as fundamentally different people than they might have become under more nurturing circumstances. They possessed remarkable memory skills and could engage in complex academic discourse, but often at the cost of their emotional intelligence, creative capacity, and ability to form genuine human connections. Many carried the scars of their educational experience throughout their adult lives, reproducing in their own families and professional relationships the same patterns of authoritarianism and emotional distance that had shaped their formative years. They had learned to suppress their natural impulses so completely that they often never recovered the ability to express joy, wonder, or spontaneous affection. Yet somehow, within this oppressive framework, the human spirit occasionally found ways to flourish. A few exceptional individuals managed to preserve their intellectual curiosity and creative potential, despite systematic attempts to eliminate both qualities. These rare scholars went on to make contributions that advanced human knowledge and understanding, often by finding creative ways to work within the constraints of their time while subtly pushing against its boundaries. Their achievements remind us that human potential, while it can be shaped and constrained by external forces, cannot ultimately be destroyed. Even in the darkest educational environments, some spark of creativity and independent thinking manages to survive, waiting for the right moment to emerge and illuminate new possibilities. The gradual evolution of educational practices, from medieval brutality to more humane approaches, represents one of humanity's great moral advances, though it took centuries to unfold and is still ongoing in many parts of the world. The recognition that children are not empty vessels to be filled with predetermined knowledge, but unique individuals with their own potential for growth and discovery, marked a fundamental shift in how we understand the purpose and methods of education. Modern educational systems, for all their remaining flaws and limitations, operate from fundamentally different assumptions about human nature and the learning process. We recognize, at least in principle, that children learn best in environments that support, rather than suppress, their natural curiosity, that mistakes are opportunities for growth rather than occasions for punishment, and that true education involves developing critical thinking skills rather than merely memorizing established authorities. The contrast with medieval approaches could hardly be more stark. Where medieval schools emphasize submission and conformity, modern education at its best encourages questioning and independent thinking. Where medieval teachers ruled through fear and intimidation, effective modern educators build relationships based on mutual respect and trust. Where medieval curricula focus narrowly on preserving existing knowledge, contemporary education aims to develop skills and perspectives that will help students navigate an uncertain future. Yet we should not be too quick to congratulate ourselves on our enlightened approaches. The legacy of medieval educational thinking persists in many subtle ways, from authoritarian classroom management styles to standardized testing regimes that prioritize conformity over creativity. The impulse to control rather than nurture, to measure rather than inspire, continues to influence educational policies and practices in ways that sometimes work against the best interests of young learners. Understanding the harsh realities of medieval education helps us appreciate how far we've come, while also reminding us of how important it is to remain vigilant against any tendency to prioritize institutional needs over student welfare. The medieval classroom serves as a powerful cautionary tale about what happens when educational systems lose sight of their fundamental purpose, helping young people develop into thoughtful, capable, compassionate human beings. The children who once shivered in those cold stone chambers, their small hands cramped around crude writing instruments as they struggled to memorize Latin texts they barely understood, were not so different from students today. They possessed the same innate capacity for wonder, creativity, and intellectual growth that characterizes young people in every generation. What differed was not their potential, but the methods used to develop or suppress that potential. Their suffering was not meaningless, for it contributed to the gradual recognition that education works best when it honors rather than violates the dignity of learners. Each generation of students who endured these harsh conditions, each teacher who began to question whether such methods were truly necessary, each parent who wondered if there might be gentler ways to prepare children for adult life, contributed to the slow evolution toward more humane educational practices. The monastery bells that once summoned medieval students to their pre-dawn prayers have long since fallen silent, but their memory reminds us of a time when education was viewed as a form of spiritual and intellectual warfare rather than a collaborative journey of discovery. We have travelled far from those cold stone classrooms, though perhaps not as far as we might hope, and the journey toward truly effective and compassionate educational practices continues with each new generation. The remarkable thing about those medieval students who somehow managed to survive their educational ordeal is that they carried within them the seeds of change. They became the scholars and teachers who would gradually, quietly, begin to question whether all that suffering was truly necessary. They were the ones who started to whisper in careful voices that perhaps there might be other ways to cultivate young minds. It took centuries for these whispered doubts to grow into genuine reform movements, but the transformation did eventually come. The printing press democratized knowledge in ways those chained library books never could. The Renaissance brought new ideas about human dignity and potential. The Enlightenment challenged the very foundations of authoritarian thinking that had shaped medieval education for so long. And slowly, painfully, like a plant pushing through concrete, more humane approaches to learning began to emerge. Educators started to recognize that fear might not be the most effective motivator, that curiosity was something to be nurtured rather than crushed, that children were individuals deserving of respect rather than raw material to be hammered into predetermined shapes. The journey from those cold medieval classrooms to our modern understanding of education represents one of humanity's great moral advances, though it's worth remembering that this progress was neither swift nor inevitable. Each generation had to choose, again and again, whether to perpetuate the harsh methods they had endured or to risk imagining something better. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of your warm bed, perhaps you can take a moment to appreciate not just how far we've travelled from those brutal educational practices, but also the countless individuals who made that journey possible, the students who refused to let their spirits be completely broken, the teachers who dared to show kindness, the parents who began to question whether learning truly required so much suffering. Their courage and persistence gave us the educational world we know today, where a child's mistake is met with guidance rather than violence, where questions are welcomed rather than punished, where the goal is to develop thinking individuals rather than compliant automatons. It's a world those medieval students could barely have imagined, yet their endurance helped make it possible. Sleep well, knowing that every comfortable classroom, every encouraging teacher, Every moment of joyful discovery in a student's life stands as a quiet monument to those who suffered, so that future generations might learn in peace. The bells have stopped ringing, the rods have been put away, and the long night of educational brutality has finally given way to something approaching dawn.